In a hillside in China, a body was sealed away for more than 2,000 years. When it was finally opened, her skin was still soft, her joints still bent, her own blood still sat inside her veins. Doctors who examined her insisted this could not be a corpse from the 2nd century before Christ. It looked like she had died weeks earlier, not 2 millennia earlier. And sealed inside her innermost coffin was something stranger still, 21 gallons of colorless liquid that scientists today still cannot fully explain. This is the tomb 2 teenage workers stumbled into by accident on a lit cigarette break, and the woman inside who never should have survived the centuries intact. The year was 1971, and China was gripped by Cold War paranoia. Tensions with the Soviet Union were running high, and citizens across the country were bombarded with a single slogan: dig deep holes, store grain, prepare for war. On the strength of that order, a hospital on the outskirts of Changsha in Hunan province was told to carve an air raid shelter into the side of a nearby hill. The hill was called Mawangdui. Nobody digging into it that year had any idea what it actually was. Workers began tunneling into the slope with shovels and hand tools, day after day, going deeper into the earth. 30 meters down, the dirt beneath them began to change. It grew looser. It started to crumble in a way ordinary soil does not. The men paused the work, tired, and sat down for a cigarette break, and that decision very nearly cost them their lives. As they lit their matches, something happened that none of them could explain. Gas was seeping up from the ground beneath their feet, and the moment the flame touched the air, it ignited. A jet of blue fire burst out of the hillside and cascaded over the nearby workers, burning several of them badly. Terrified, the survivors fled straight to local officials and reported what they had seen in the only language that made sense to them: a ghost fire rising out of the earth itself. Think about what that flame actually meant. 2,000 years after it was sealed shut, something below that hillside was still, in a very real chemical sense, alive. What the workers had ignited was methane, a natural byproduct of decomposition happening in a space that had been cut off from oxygen for centuries. The tomb below them had been airtight for so long that it was still producing gas from a body sealed inside it before written history had even reached that part of the world. Word of the strange fire eventually reached archaeologists, but in the political climate of the time, appetite and funding for a full excavation were both painfully small. The initial budget amounted to a few $100s in today's money, nowhere near enough to move the sheer volume of clay and charcoal packed into that hillside. So officials turned to the only labor force available in the numbers required. 1,500 local high school students were pulled from their classrooms and sent up the hill with baskets and bare hands. The work was brutal. Rain turned the site to mud. Scaffolding was unreliable at best. Teenagers dug for hours with nothing but their fingers, their palms left bleeding and full of splinters from the rough bamboo baskets they used to haul dirt away. The director of the excavation later recalled watching some of them dig straight into the ground with their bare hands because it was faster than waiting for tools. It took nearly a year of that grinding, unglamorous labor before the team finally broke through to a burial chamber, sealed beneath layers of bamboo matting, each panel stamped with the Chinese character for family. Nobody working that hillside, student or scientist, was prepared for what waited for them on the other side of that seal. Beneath the bamboo matting, the excavation team found a wooden burial chamber, and inside it, a stack of coffins nested one inside the other like a set of Russian dolls. 4 of them in total, each one smaller than the last, each one painted with elaborate lacquer designs of clouds and mythical guardians meant to protect the soul of whoever lay within. As the workers pried open coffin after coffin, one of them lifted a lid covering a nearby pot and called out in astonishment. Inside was a bowl of broth with slices of lotus root still floating in it, still intact after 2,000 years. Within moments of hitting open air, the fragile slices dissolved and sank before anyone could photograph them, a small preview of just how fast the ancient world can vanish the instant modern air touches it. But the coffins were the real prize, and the innermost one held something nobody expected. 75 centimeters of clear liquid, oxidizing to a rusty brown the moment it met the open air. And resting inside that liquid, wrapped in a cocoon of decayed silk, was a body. Once the silk was carefully cut away, layer by layer, over the course of an entire week, what lay underneath left the entire excavation team speechless. No mummy had ever been found in this condition, not close. Her skin was soft, supple, and still had a faint elasticity when touched. Her joints bent freely, completely unaffected by the rigor mortis you would expect from any corpse, let alone one over 2,000 years old. She still had hair. She still had eyelashes. She even still had the fine hairs inside her nose. When the autopsy team examined her further, they found something that seemed almost impossible to believe. Type A blood, still present in her veins, and in her stomach, the actual remains of her final meal, still identifiable after 21 centuries. Her fingerprints were so clearly preserved that, in theory, if fingerprint technology had existed in her own lifetime, you could have used them to identify her the same way you would identify someone today. The level of preservation was so extraordinary that it sparked real disagreement among the scientists studying her. Some argued she shouldn't even be classified as a mummy at all, that the word implied something dried out and fragile, and what lay in that coffin looked closer to a fresh cadaver than an ancient relic. Eventually, the field settled the debate by widening the definition itself. A mummy, they agreed, is simply any body whose soft tissue has been preserved, whether that happened on purpose or by accident. By that standard, she qualified, even if she broke every expectation of what a 2,000-year-old body was supposed to look like. But here is what made her truly strange among the mummies of the world. She had not been dried out. She had not been sealed in the traditional Egyptian style, with her organs removed and her body packed in salt until it shriveled. Whatever had happened to her inside that coffin belonged to a completely different tradition, one that had been quietly developing in China for centuries, built on an idea almost nobody outside the field has ever heard of. When most people picture a mummy, they picture Egypt. And the Egyptian method is, in blunt terms, a kind of preserved jerky. The internal organs were removed entirely. The body was packed and dried using natron, a naturally occurring salt, drawing every trace of moisture out over weeks. The result is effective at stopping decay, but the bodies it produces are shriveled, fragile, and brittle, the skin drawn tight over bone, everything about them announcing their age at a glance. China experimented with that same dry approach for a time, but somewhere along the way, ancient morticians tried something almost nobody expects. Instead of removing the moisture from the body, what if you left it in? Instead of drying the body out, what if you found a way to stop decomposition while the organs, the fluids, and the soft tissue all stayed exactly where they were? The technique produced what researchers now call wet mummies, bodies preserved not through dehydration, but through the opposite principle entirely. Decomposition needs one of two things to proceed: active bacteria or oxygen for those bacteria to survive on. Cut off either one, and decay simply stops in its tracks. Chinese morticians during the Song and Ming dynasties refined a method built on exactly that principle, sometimes nicknamed, rather unfortunately, the sticky rice soup method. Despite the name, nobody was floating in broth. Graves were sealed using a mixture of lime, clay, sand, and sticky rice water, a combination that hardened into something close to airtight concrete around the coffin. No oxygen could get in, no bacteria could survive inside, and the body, still fully intact, organs and all, simply stopped decaying where it lay. This wasn't a one-off experiment. The wife of a bureaucrat, found sealed by this same rice water method in a tomb elsewhere in China, showed remarkably similar preservation centuries after her burial, proof that this was a deliberate, repeatable tradition, not a lucky accident that happened once. But here is where the woman from Mawangdui stands apart from every other wet mummy on record, including the ones sealed by that very method. She was not dehydrated, and she was not sealed using the lime and rice water technique either. Whatever preserved her body used none of the standard playbook that had kept other Chinese mummies intact for centuries. Something else was at work inside that coffin, something her own morticians appear to have improvised or perfected entirely on their own, and to this day, nobody has been able to fully reproduce it. To understand why anyone would go to such extraordinary lengths for one woman's body, you have to understand who she was in life, because the sheer scale of effort poured into preserving her was not accidental, and it was not universal. Most people in Han Dynasty China received nothing close to this kind of burial. She did, and everything sealed into that tomb alongside her explains exactly why the people who buried her were determined that death would not diminish her in the slightest. Her name was Xinjui. History remembers her by a different title, Lady Dai, taken from her husband Li Chang, the Marquis of Dai and Chancellor of the Changsha Kingdom during the Western Han Dynasty, more than 2,000 years ago. She was not a peasant, and every object sealed into her tomb makes that unmistakably clear. To understand why her family went to such extraordinary lengths to preserve her, you first have to understand the beliefs driving Han Dynasty burial practice. It was widely held at the time that the soul was imperishable, that a person continued living on in another realm after death, and that the living had a sacred duty to prepare the dead for that next life exactly as they had lived this one. This duty connected directly to filial piety, the Confucian principle of honoring your parents and elders, and there was no more powerful way to demonstrate that respect than by ensuring a loved one entered the afterlife, surrounded by comfort and status. For a noble family like hers, that meant years of planning, an enormous undertaking of construction and preparation, all built around one goal, making certain she would want for nothing. And so her tomb was not simply sealed, it was stocked. Over 1,000 separate artifacts were found buried alongside her, an almost overwhelming record of exactly how a wealthy Han Dynasty woman lived. 100 silk garments filled her wardrobe, cut and layered for every season of the year. 182 pieces of lacquerware surrounded her, cups and wine jugs crafted for entertaining. Cosmetics and toiletries were laid in beside her, so that even in death she could keep up appearances. And carved wooden figurines representing servants and musicians were placed nearby, ready to wait on her and provide entertainment in whatever world came next. This was a woman, by every account, who had lived well. She was reportedly a great beauty in her youth, known for hosting lavish parties filled with music and feasting. And whoever arranged her burial clearly understood that a woman who loved to entertain in life should not go without a feast in death either. Several dozen pots were sealed into her tomb, packed with food for the afterlife. Some of it was ordinary fare for the era: strawberries, dates, plums, venison, and beef. But Lady Dai, it turns out, had far more extravagant tastes than the average Han Dynasty aristocrat. Her tomb also contained turtle dove, crane, dog, and owl, delicacies reserved almost exclusively for the wealthiest households, a world away from the simple wheat and soybeans that ordinary people of her era survived on. It paints the picture of a woman who never once had to compromise her appetite in life or, as far as her family could arrange it, in death. But that same appetite, the very luxury this tomb was built to honor, left its mark on her body in ways her family could never have anticipated. And when scientists finally opened her up centuries later, her own organs would tell a story none of that silk and lacquer ever could. When the autopsy team finally examined Lady Dai's body, they were not just looking at a marvel of preservation, they were looking at a complete medical record, one written into her organs and left untouched for over 2,000 years. And what that record revealed was a life of extraordinary comfort that had quietly, steadily been killing her. The evidence started small. Despite her wealth, despite the servants at her command, her body carried not one but two intestinal parasites, tapeworms and whipworms, almost certainly picked up through the food hygiene standards of her era, standards that no amount of money could fully protect against. She also carried numerous gallstones, the kind that would have caused her real, recurring pain and discomfort throughout her final years. But the more serious damage was further down. Doctors found a fused disc in her lower spine, an injury that would have been genuinely debilitating, forcing her to walk with a cane by the relatively young age of 50. And that immobility set off a chain reaction. Unable to exercise, unable to work off the rich diet her status afforded her, she developed obesity. Her arteries began clogging with fat, a condition called arteriosclerosis, and a blood clot eventually formed inside a vessel of her heart, a coronary thrombosis. Even her tomb seemed to acknowledge her suffering. Buried alongside her were treatments for angina, cinnamon, magnolia bark, and peppercorns, remedies her household had likely turned to again and again in her final years, trying to manage pain her own morticians clearly knew about. The evidence of her very last day is almost unsettling in its precision. In her stomach, scientists recovered the remains of her final meal, a large portion of melon, confirmed by counting 138 and a half individual seeds still sitting exactly where she'd swallowed them. Somewhere in the hours that followed that meal, in the middle of summer, with a body already straining under obesity, clogged arteries, and a heart already compromised, Lady Dai suffered a fatal heart attack. It was, in the end, an entirely ordinary cause of death. And that ordinariness is exactly what stunned the scientific world. Before her autopsy, many experts believed that diet-related heart disease, the kind driven by rich food, inactivity, and excess weight, was essentially a modern affliction, a byproduct of 20th century abundance and convenience. Lady Dai's own arteries proved that assumption wrong by more than 2,000 years. The condition that kills millions of people today was quietly killing wealthy Han Dynasty aristocrats in exactly the same way, more than 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. Her cause of death, in the end, was never really in question. The clot in her heart told that story clearly enough on its own, but solving how she died was the easy half of this mystery. The far stranger question, the one that still has no confirmed answer today, was sitting in the coffin all along, in 21 gallons of liquid nobody has ever been able to fully explain. Every other coffin inside that burial chamber was found dry. Only the innermost one, the coffin holding Lady Dai's own body, contained liquid, 21 gallons of it, clear when it was first uncovered and darkening to a rusty brown within moments of touching open air. And more than 50 years after her discovery, scientists still cannot agree on exactly what that liquid was, or what role, if any, it played in keeping her so extraordinarily intact. One explanation is straightforward. Groundwater. Lady Dai's tomb sat below the local water table, and over the course of 2,000 years, water could plausibly have seeped through the sealed layers of clay and charcoal surrounding her coffin, slowly filling the innermost chamber by pure accident. This theory gains real support from something else discovered nearby. The tombs belonging to her husband and to a young man, believed to be her son, were both damaged by construction work during the 20th century, breaking their airtight seals and allowing water to flood in and destroy their remains. If groundwater could ruin 2 nearby tombs that badly, the reasoning goes, then perhaps it simply seeped into hers too, just more gently, more slowly, and by extraordinary chance, in a way that helped rather than harmed. But not every researcher is convinced, and the objections are serious ones. If the liquid was simply ordinary groundwater, why did it appear in only the innermost coffin, and none of the 3 coffins surrounding it, each one supposedly sealed the same way? Why did it turn brown almost instantly on contact with air, a reaction more consistent with a chemically active substance than plain water? And why, when scientists finally tested it directly, did it come back with a chemical composition different from the water found damaging the neighboring tombs? Laboratory analysis did manage to establish one solid fact. The liquid was slightly acidic, a property that could plausibly have given it antimicrobial qualities, actively working against the bacteria that cause decay rather than merely surrounding the body by coincidence. But beyond that single measurable clue, the trail runs cold. Nobody has been able to identify precisely what the liquid contained, or definitively prove whether it was manufactured on purpose or simply the product of 2,000 years of slow geological accident. It leaves behind a genuinely unresolved question, one this investigation cannot honestly claim to answer. Did Lady Dai's morticians, working more than 2,000 years ago, somehow develop a preservation fluid capable of keeping a human body this intact for millennia? And if they did, was it a deliberate formula, refined and understood, or something closer to a desperate experiment, thrown together and never repeated, that simply happened to work far better than anyone could have predicted? If there ever was a written recipe, it did not survive with her. What survived instead was the result, sealed in clay and silence for 21 centuries, waiting for a spark from a worker's cigarette to bring it back into the light. And once that light reached her, the very thing that had preserved her for so long finally began, for the first time, to work against her. Lady Dai was not preserved because ancient morticians solved the riddle of mummification. She may simply be the luckiest accident in the history of archaeology, and even now, nobody has managed to fully repeat it. What she left behind rewrote assumptions about heart disease, about wealth and appetite in the Han Dynasty, and about how thoroughly the past can survive when the conditions are exactly right. The liquid in her coffin remains unexplained. The recipe, if one ever existed, is gone. Somewhere else in China, sealed under clay and charcoal, another tomb like hers may still be waiting, quietly, for its own accidental spark to bring it back into the light. Subscribe for the next investigation, and I will see you in the next one.